You see that there was a people that were discovering who God was, and this is a God who is not like other gods. And so as the people are now coming out of Egypt, they're reconnecting with this God that they had heard about from their ancestors, a God who wasn't like the gods of the Egyptians, and he wasn't like the gods of the tribes that lived around them in the wilderness. He was truly unique, a God unlike other gods. Not only that, they were starting to discover that they were to be a people who were not like other people, that they were a nation that was called. Early on in their history, there was this dynamic to who they were, this reality that they were a people who had a specific purpose in this world, that they had relationship with God, but that relationship wasn't meant to create some sort of isolationist attitude among the people of Israel. It wasn't so that they were special and everybody else wasn't. They had a relationship with God, a connection with their Creator that was so dynamic that it resulted in them bringing flourishing and shalom and hope to the world around them. That was the original purpose of Israel. So as they're coming out of Egypt, they are now starting to reconnect with this God who is not like other gods, and they're starting to discover what it means or what it looks like to be a people who are not like other people. That last part, being a people who are not like other people, as we've kind of walked through the book of Leviticus, it's been sort of an ongoing theme. And if you've been here a couple of weeks, you know I've been saying this phrase like over and over again. And part of why it's so compelling for me right now is that, I don't know if you're noticing this, but our world is desperately in need of people who are not like other people. Amen? Like you turn on the news today and it takes about 5 seconds to realize like we could definitely use some people who are not like other people. And so this story in Leviticus and this story of these people, it's pointing the way to allow us to be a new kind of people, for us to be a different kind of person with a different kind of purpose living in this world, because there's something about a person upon whom God dwells or within whom God dwells. There's something about a people within whom God is moving and active and alive in. And that's ultimately what this is all about. Now, all of this brings us to where we are tonight, which is Leviticus chapter 11. So if you have a Bible, you can flip over to there. If you don't have a Bible, there's no worries because the words will all be on the screen. But Leviticus chapter 11 is really interesting because it introduces some specific instructions for these people that are very different than the instructions we've received up to now. If you've been here, you know we've been talking about sacrifices. We've been talking about all of these offerings that the people were making, all of these sort of worship services. And now we move into a conversation. We move into some guidelines around the dietary practices of the Jews. In fact, what we're going to read tonight is really just dietary guidelines. It's basically, here's what you're supposed to eat and here's what you're not supposed to eat. I know some of you've been waiting for this. I know it's so exciting. You've been like, I can't wait till we get to Leviticus 11 because it's dietary stuff and I just love this stuff. But here's the deal. As I spend some time, and obviously like I find myself a couple of times this week going, why are we studying Leviticus? I'll admit that and confess that to you. There's another part of me that's like, I know that embedded in all of this, there's something else that's really practical. So for me on the surface, yes, there is an explanation for what we're going to read tonight, but there is also beneath the surface something that is deeper, that is a deeper issue that's lurking amidst what we're going to be unpacking tonight. This is not just a passage about dietary guidelines. It turns out that what we're going to look at, what we're going to understand tonight has something to do with freedom. And freedom in our culture is sort of a passion of ours in our nation. In fact, not only is it a passion of ours, but freedom is something that we care very much about. It's something that we try to exercise. It's something that we try to protect. It's something that we will get very heated over if somebody infringes on it in our own lives. There is something about the topic of freedom, when people start talking about freedom, that sort of brings things out of people, and there's a reason why. Deeply hardwired inside of every human being, in all of us, there's this deep intrinsic desire to be free. We all want to experience this thing that we call freedom. And so when we come to a passage like this one tonight and it talks about freedom, when we start to address or consider issues of freedom, there's something that stirs inside of us as we unpack this sort of thing. So if you have a Bible, we're going to start reading in verse 1 of Leviticus chapter 11. In fact, tonight we're going to do something we have not done very often through this study. Tonight we're actually going to read the entire chapter together, and you'll see why we haven't done it very often through this study. I don't know why we're doing it tonight, but I just decided it'd be a good idea, because every now and then you got to do something like this just to see if people can stay awake longer than 5 minutes. So tonight, Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1, dietary guidelines for the people of Israel says this: the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the people of Israel, saying, these are the living things that you may eat among all of the animals that are on the earth. Verse 2, we're going to talk about animals for a minute. He says, whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud among the animals, you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the rock badger, which I know tonight some of you planned on a little rock badger barbecue after this. And it sort of wrecked your plans, I know. But you're not supposed to eat the rock badger because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof. It's unclean to you. And the hare, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. You shall not eat any of their flesh. You shall not touch their carcasses. They're unclean to you. Now, verse 9, we move from animals to aquatic animals. These you may eat of all that are in the waters. Everything in the waters that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, you may eat. But anything in the seas or the rivers that does not have fins or scales, of the swarming creatures in the waters and of the living creatures that are in the waters, is detestable to you. You shall regard them as detestable. You shall not eat any of their flesh. You shall not detest their carcasses. Everything in the waters that does not have fins and scales is detestable to you. Verse 13, we move to things that fly. And these you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable. The eagle. Don't eat eagles, especially in America. Don't do this, right? The bearded vulture. The shaven vulture's fine. You can eat that. But the bearded vulture, that's unique and you don't eat that one. The black vulture. The kite. I didn't even know that was a bird till this week. The falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, because every now and then you get a craving for seagull in the middle of the night, right? Don't do it. A hawk of any kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the short-eared owl, the barn owl, the tawny owl, the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe, and the bat, which I'm just puzzled by bats being included with birds, but that's a whole other issue. Verse 20 says, all winged insects, so now we're going to move to insects. All winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. However, good news for those of you that love crickets and grasshoppers, here we go. Yet among the winged insects that go on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet. Of course, right? So obvious. With which to hop on the ground. Of them you may eat the locust, the bald locust of any kind. So there's no prejudice against the bald locust here. The cricket of any kind, and the grasshopper of any kind. But all other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you. And by these you shall become unclean, and whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries any part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. And every animal that parts the hoof but is not cloven-footed or does not chew the cud is unclean to you. Everyone who touches them shall be unclean. And then verse 27, and all that walk on their paws among the animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. In other words, don't eat your cat and don't eat your dog. That's like this final little note here. Don't eat the family pets. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. And he who carries their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They're unclean to you. And these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground. Now we're moving to the swarming things that swarm on the ground. The mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, the chameleon. These are all unclean to you. Go figure, right? Among those things that swarm. Whoever touches them when they're dead shall be unclean until the evening, and anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it's an article of wood or garment of skin or a sack or any article that is used for any purpose. It must be put into water. It shall be unclean until the evening. Then it shall be clean. And if any of them falls into any earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. Any food that could be eaten on which water comes shall be unclean, and all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. Basically what he's saying is this: don't drink water with bugs in it. Kind of interesting, right? And so he goes on, he continues on in this way. Verse 41, we get down to this. We'll move a little quickly through here. He says, every swarming thing that swarms on the ground is detestable. It shall not be eaten. Whatever goes on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet, any swarming thing that swarms on the ground you shall not eat, for they are detestable. You shall not make yourselves detestable with any swarming thing that swarms. It's starting to sound a little bit like a Dr. Seuss poem at this point, right? And clearly God does not like swarming things that swarm Sam I am. And you shall not defile yourselves with them and become unclean through them. Then verse 44, this is when we start to get to the point of this. He says this: for I am the Lord your God, Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourself with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I'm a God who's not like other gods. You shall therefore be a people who are not like other people. You shall be holy, for I'm holy. I'm a God not like other gods. You're a people not like other people. This is the law about the beast and the bird and every living creature that moves through the water and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten. And all God's people said, amen, right? Like in a scale of 1 to 10 of weirdness, this is like a 9.5, is it not? Is it not? Like, how many of you agree? Like, this is a little bit unusual, a little bit strange. Like, what is going on here? I find myself looking at this, and whenever I ask this question, like, what's going on in a text, there's 2 levels to this. There's this level that says, okay, so what's happening? Like, what in the world is going on that God is being so detailed and giving all of these instructions about what people are supposed to eat and not supposed to eat? Like, all of these things, what's happening in the text? But when I ask that question, I'm also asking this: what's happening inside of me and what's happening inside of those people as they hear these words? What happens when we start listening to this sort of thing and start thinking about God being serious about giving us these sort of instructions? What's happening inside of us? 2 different dynamics to the same question. I want to start with the first part of this. What's happening in this text? If you want to take some notes and think about this so you really do understand, here's some good ideas that you might want to just like lodge away so you know what Leviticus 11 is all about. On the surface, this is pretty straightforward. In fact, one of the best explanations, I'm going to give you 2 very good explanations for what's going on here. One of the best is this: having come out of slavery, these people for the last 400 years, they've really just been following the customs of the Egyptians. They've been having the same dietary practices as the Egyptians. In fact, whether they were receiving food or not, we don't have a lot of detail, but they were definitely suffering in the land of Egypt. It may be that they were also eating things. They were desperate. There was a level of desperation. There was a level of unhealth. These are people who were living in bondage. They were a slave population. So you understand that as a slave population for several hundred years, knowing how to conduct life, this is a new thing. For the first time ever in their lives, they are free and they're learning how to live life. And so these people needed some specific instruction. It's simply God saying, listen, now that you're no longer slaves, there are certain things that you should and shouldn't eat. And so he sort of lays these things out here, like pigs. Verse 7, he says, don't eat pigs. Well, we look back on that and we go, isn't that kind of interesting, like God's singling out some of these animals like pigs? Well, it's interesting, maybe puzzling, until you understand that there are things like trichinosis in pork. And if you don't cook pork to a perfect temperature, which we know this in our culture, then these parasites continue to live on. And when you ingest trichinosis, when you get these parasites in your system, they wreak all sorts of havoc, and they can actually kill you. And so when God says don't eat pork, one of the issues was people were eating pork all the time, and they were dying. And if God has people who have a plan for their lives, it's probably a pretty good idea for them to stay upright and living in the world, right? And so he's like, hey, don't eat pork. Like, this is a pretty good thing. Like, he's giving them very good dietary rules that are based on biological, nutritional, parasitic information that was not available at the time. There were no microscopes to know why, well, that guy ate a pig and he dies. I don't understand. We're going to eat another pig tonight, right? They didn't understand why this was happening. And so pigs carried viruses, and God said, don't eat pigs. That's just one example. Verse 9 is another example, the fish. He's very specific. He says, if you want to eat stuff in the water, eat the stuff with scales and fins on it, but don't eat all of the stuff that we love to cover in butter and steam and cover with garlic and put on a table and enjoy. Just last night, I had scallops, and they were so amazing. And God says, don't eat the scallops. Don't eat the lobster. Don't eat the crayfish. What's he talking about? He's talking about bottom feeders. All of those things, all of those crustaceans, they're bottom feeders. Well, bottom feeders, what do they eat? They eat the dead stuff at the bottom of whatever body of water they're in. Because of that, even in our culture today, shellfish has the potential to be very corrupt. It has the potential to poison us. It carries viruses. It can make you incredibly sick. That's why it's monitored so heavily in our culture. And again, what God is doing is giving them incredibly advanced scientific information so that they can avoid parasites and bacteria and viruses so that they can be healthy. And we see that this God is a God of science who is thousands of years ahead of man's exploration and technology and understanding. He's giving them these things. That's a pretty good explanation for what's going on here, isn't it? It's kind of cool, isn't it, to think that that's how, that God cares about the details, and he cares about us so much that even our individual health, even our individual flourishing is something that he's concerned about. It's sort of a beautiful thing, right? God cares about our physical being and how we care for our bodies. That's food for thought, is it not? Pun intended there, right? Food for thought. Some of you'll get that one on the way home. Here's another explanation. If you're a people who are coming out of slavery and your call is to be a distinct people, if you're supposed to be different than all of the other people that are living in all the lands around you, all of these tribes that have cropped up while you've been living in the land of Egypt, if you're to be distinct from them, then there ought to be something that's observably different about you, right? There ought to be something that's unique about you. A lot of the neighbors of the Israelites, as they were wandering through this desert, they not only ate these unclean animals, but these unclean animals that God is referencing in Leviticus 11 were used in their pagan sacrifices and rituals. And I just want to remind you that the animal sacrifice is not something that the people of Israel came up with. This is not something that God institutes in the book of Leviticus. It's actually a practice among all of humanity. And what God does is enter into the language that people were using at this time, and he's delineating within a language they would understand who he is from other gods. God is communicating in a way that people could understand. And so in this circumstance, God is entering into this, and he's saying, listen, your neighbors, they use weasels, and they use skinks, and they use pigs, and they use all sorts of strange animals to worship their false gods, and I want you to be different than them. You need to set yourselves apart. Don't be like the Egyptians that you just kind of came out of their land. Don't be like the people that live around you. You need to have some distinctives about you. Not only that, these things are always associated with things that pull people away from me, not toward me. And I don't want you to be a part of anything that pulls people away from me rather than toward me. I want there to be a distinct line. You need to establish who you are. He's helping them as newly freed slaves develop an identity for themselves. And there's beautiful foreshadowing in all of this. This is why in verse 44 he says this. He says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I'm holy." And then verse 45 he says, "For I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy as I'm holy." You are a different kind of people. So again, another really great explanation, right? So we have these dietary issues. Not only that, but we have these cultural issues. And it seems to make sense that maybe around food, God would care about these things. Maybe God would care about their bodies, and maybe God would care about their religious practices at such a level that he would talk about these things. But then as you sort of think about this, you start to ask other questions like, does God really care what we eat, right? Does God really care what you and I eat? Today, most of us have eaten a number of things. Do you think God cares about the things that you've consumed today? Does God care about our lives at that level of detail? Does God care about our food? A few years ago, Sherry and I decided to make some dietary shifts. We had been eating a lot of bat steaks at that point in life, and we just decided, no, I'm kidding. We decided, after a while, we decided that we were going to try being vegetarians. And so for about a 2-year time period, Sherry and I, this was 3 or 4 years ago, we were practicing vegetarians. Practicing because I never planned on being a completed one. I just was practicing it because I never thought I'd stick there. In fact, one day I met a steak that I couldn't deny, and so I just quit being a vegetarian while I was fishing in Montana. But we were vegetarians for 2 years, and there's 2 things that I discovered while I was a vegetarian. Number one is this: bacon is everywhere. Bacon is my kryptonite, and bacon is everywhere. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the sermon tonight. I just thought I'd tell you this. Bacon is everywhere, and you don't realize it until you're a vegetarian, and then you realize bacon is on salads. They wrap everything in bacon. You can put bacon you can put it in bread. You can put bacon everywhere. And when I was a vegetarian, all I wanted was for somebody to come up with a really great tasting artificial bacon. And every now and then someone would be like, well, there's turkey bacon. And I'd say, it's still meat. You don't get it. Just because it's fake bacon doesn't mean it's, whatever. But anyway, so again, that has nothing to do with the message. That's just one thing you learn when you're a vegetarian. The second thing you learn is this: people are super sensitive around food issues, right? You learn this. You learn that people are really, they're really concerned about food stuff. You discover that people are really passionate around their diets, around their food, around what they eat. People don't want anybody telling them what they should eat, and they don't want to tell anybody. It's just this weird dynamic around food, right? Unless somebody discovers a special diet. Like, if you discover a diet that if you stay on it for 30 days, you grow wings and fly, everybody will tell you about that diet, right? Have you noticed that? Oh, you ought to try this. You ought to try that. It works for me, right? And everybody, you get passionate about this stuff. We get passionate about our food. We care about our food, which is really interesting because it's something that seems so insignificant that when I ask you whether or not God cares about our food and what we put in our bodies, some of our knee-jerk reaction is, well, I don't know that he really does. And yet when you think about our passion for food, maybe it is something God is concerned about. Maybe there's something more going on in this. So we have this tendency to decide what God is into and what he's not into. We have this habit of saying, well, I think God's really just kind of into the big things in life. I don't think God's really caring about the little things in life. I think there's big goals, and God's basically saying, get the big stuff right. Don't worry about the small stuff. Like some of us, we work with miserable people. I can't say that because I work here. But some of us work with miserable people, right? And you're just if you get home and you didn't kill one of your coworkers, you're like, God, I feel like I did good today. I feel like we did really good. That's a big thing. You don't want me to kill people. I didn't kill anybody I work with this week. And so I think we're all good, right? We tend to think that's the stuff that God worries about, right? That's what God's really thinking about. He's really concerned about the big stuff. The question is, when we start to say that, the question is this: who decides what's big and what's little? Who decides what's significant and what's insignificant? See, there's this tendency, whenever we do that, whenever we start thinking about the things that God really cares about, well, does God really care about this thing that you eat or drink or do, or this behavior you engage? Whenever we start asking those questions, we're the ones that are answering that, aren't we? We're the ones that are saying, well, I think God really cares about this. I don't think God cares about this. I think God cares about this. And when we do that, we're putting God in a box. We're defining for God what we think he cares about. And ironically, if you follow that logic all the way through, it means that we're not letting God be God. We're becoming God, aren't we? We're the ones that are becoming God because we're deciding what God really cares about. We're deciding what really matters and what doesn't. And why do we do that? We do that because this is a freedom issue. We do that because when we read Leviticus chapter 11 and there's somebody that's telling us what we can eat and what we can't eat, when there's somebody suggesting that there ought to be restrictions or boundaries around those things, we get uncomfortable because it feels like somebody's touching our freedom. And here's a principle that is true of us. Any one of us that have grown up in this great country of ours, this is true of all of us. It is a cultural value. We don't want anyone, including God, messing with our freedom, do we? We don't want anybody messing with our freedom. Nobody messes with our freedom. So when it appears as if God may be sort of getting involved in some of the details and meddling a little bit in areas of our lives, we begin to say, well, I'm not sure that God cares about those small things in my life. God sort of cares about the big stuff. We push him out of the places where he might be working the most because we don't want him to mess with our freedom. It's kind of an interesting thing. When you open up your Bible to Leviticus chapter 11, in a lot of Bibles, the heading at the top of this section that we just read says dietary restrictions. And as I was reading that this week, I realized the issue for us is not the first word. The issue for most of us is the second word. It's restrictions. We don't like the word restrictions because we are a freedom-oriented culture. We are a liberated culture. We're a culture that loves to be free. And there is no one anywhere in our cultural context that ever puts the word restriction in the same word with freedom and thinks that one leads to the other, right? No one ever talks about restriction leading to freedom. And so we hear the word restriction and we have this response to this. Restriction isn't freedom. It's infringing upon freedom. And so God in this moment is infringing upon our freedom. This might actually explain some of the problems that we have in our culture today, some of the things that are stirring at the base, our foundation as a people today. I remember years ago, there was a movie that came out. About 20 years ago, a movie came out with Mel Gibson playing William Wallace, the amazing movie Braveheart. How many of you saw Braveheart years ago? I promised myself 20 years ago that I would never reference Braveheart in a message. And here I am 20 years later, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to do it. But here's why I'm going to do it. Because there's an iconic scene. There's this one moment in Braveheart when he's rallying all of his troops, all of the ragtag people from the Scottish countryside who are going to be defending their lands against the nation of England. There's this moment in which he's rallying all of these men, and he's getting them to like go into battle with all of the fervor. And there's this iconic time when he stands in front of these men and he says these words, and some of you have said this yourselves. You've practiced it in your own Scottish brogue. You've said, they can take our lives, but they can't take our freedom. How many of you ever heard that? How many of you ever said that? You've actually practiced, like, they can take our lives, but they can't take our freedom, right? You've said that, right? You've practiced it. You've done it. I remember when that was said. I remember watching that movie for the first time. I remember Sherry and I, we were like in our first year of marriage. I was in our apartment. She was like gone. I was watching it by myself. And at that moment, like, I was like standing, like, yes, I will go into battle. You can take our lives, but you can't take our freedom. But then I look at that quote and I think, wait a second. Based on our cultural definition of freedom, if you take my life, you take my freedom, right? So then you kind of scratch your head and go, well, wait a second. If that's true, then maybe freedom isn't what I think freedom is. Maybe our definition of freedom is different than what freedom really is. Maybe our culture has created a value around freedom that is not what freedom really is. Is it possible that maybe we get nervous around freedom issues? Is it possible that we get passionate around freedom issues, but we don't really understand what freedom is to begin with? Is that a possibility? Do we really know what freedom is? There's a concept that is consistently presented throughout the New Testament regarding Christ followers. There's an idea that we see repeated over and over again. And yet with our dominant value of individual freedom in our culture, it's a concept that we ignore as Christ followers. If you're a Christian, if you're here tonight and you consider yourself a Christian, there is a truism that is stated repeatedly throughout the scriptures. And yet because of our value of freedom, we have this tendency to turn a blind eye to it. We ignore one of the most significant statements about our freedom that changes everything. It's one of the most countercultural, radical ideas that's presented about human existence throughout the New Testament. We see it in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The Apostle Paul is talking to the Corinthian church, which, by the way, the Corinthian church was a church that had all sorts of liberty issues. They had exercised all sorts of liberty in all sorts of areas of their life. And the Apostle Paul says this, and it's life-altering. He says in verse 19, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God?" And then this next part changes everything. "You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." You're not your own. Well, what Paul is saying is this. He's saying, listen, when you made the decision to receive the grace of Jesus, when you made the decision to receive the love, when you made the decision to be accepted and to walk and to follow Jesus, when you entered into that relationship, there was a transfer of ownership of your life. And while you thought you were in control of it, you now took the life that you thought you were in control of and you turned over the ownership of your life to Jesus. So what I'm discovering as I unpack this and I think about this in our rugged individualistic culture is this whole concept that I don't belong to me. This is radical. This is life-altering. This flies in the face of how you and I understand freedom, does it not? I don't belong to me. You don't belong to you. We don't belong to ourselves. We belong to Jesus. And somehow in the middle of this, there is this paradox that in belonging to Jesus, in surrendering control of our own lives, we actually discover what true freedom is. That's real freedom. You turn over to Galatians chapter 5, again, another letter written by the same Apostle Paul to another church, the church at Galatia, and he says this in verse 1, check this out. Yes, you've been bought with a price, but he says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. In other words, he's saying this. You were bought with a price, but here's what Jesus did. Before you were purchased, you were in slavery, just like the Egyptians, or just like the Israelites when they were with the Egyptians for 430 years. You were enslaved. When Jesus buys you, he owns you, but the reason he owns you is to set you free. It is so contradictory to how we think in our culture. Jesus buys you out of the slavery that you thought was freedom, and he releases you into a new sort of understanding as you give your life to him. Verse 13, same chapter, he says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters." There is this thing inside of the human soul that says, I want to be free. That is universal. And Jesus says, it's available in me. A couple of ideas about freedom based on this. A couple of things for us to think about. Freedom is not the ability to do what you want to do when you want to do it. That is not what freedom is. It might be freedom based on our culture, but it is not freedom. Freedom is not the ability to have or to possess whatever you want to have whenever you want to have it. That is not the definition of freedom. Freedom is not your ability or your mobility to go anywhere that you want to go anytime you want to go there. In fact, many people, there are anecdotal stories everywhere of individuals who have done these things. They've done whatever they want to do. They have gone wherever they want to go. They have whatever they want to have, and they're not free. They're in more bondage than they've ever been in their lives because they've pursued these things. That's not freedom. Freedom is not you and I getting to do anything, everything that we want at any time we want it. That's not freedom. True freedom is this. True freedom is not needing something. True freedom is not needing anything. True freedom is something that is not dependent on any experience or possession or thing or moment that is in front of us. That is true freedom. See, we all have this stuff in our life. Like, we just kind of function. We go through our days. We all have these things. And whether we acknowledge it or not, maybe in moments like this we see it, but there are things that we sort of need to do, right? There's stuff in our life that we go, man, I have to have this. If I don't have this, I'm not going to be whole as a person. I'm not going to be content as a person. All of us have things. Some of us, it's a relationship. Some of us, it's substances. Some of it's food. Some of us, there's all sorts of things, right? There's all sorts of things. We just sort of move through our lives, and we have this sense like, if I'm going to get through my day and be free, then I need to be able to engage in these sort of things. Some of those things are very good things. Some of those things are very neutral things. But here's the deal. If you have to have anything, then you aren't free. If you have to be able to have anything, then you aren't free. If there's anything that you need, if you find yourself saying, I just need this, then you aren't free. If you can't go without something, then you aren't free. True freedom is the ability to say, I could, but I don't need it. Look at something else. In those verses in 1 Corinthians 6, right before what we just read, listen to this. The Apostle Paul said these words. He said, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be what? What's the word there? Dominated by anything. Basically, he's saying this. I'm not going to be mastered by anything. I'm not going to let anything own me in my life. Yeah, there's all this stuff in the world that we live in. There's all this stuff, and it's incredibly neutral. Like everything is out there. Like, it's all lawful for me, but it's not all beneficial for me. And here's the deal. Even though it's lawful, it has the ability to enslave me. It could put me in bondage. Things that are neutral can hold me captive. And Paul says, I'm not going to let that happen. And you start to see where this whole thing is going. Freedom is not the ability to say that I can eat or drink or watch or listen to whatever I want. Freedom is the reality. It's the ability to say, oh, I can, but I don't need to. That's true freedom. And why is that freedom? It's freedom because any of those things, anything that you and I can possess in this life, anything that you and I can consume in this life, anything that we can take, anything that we can drink, any relationship that we can be in this life will not satisfy us. It will not fill the void that is in our souls. Only Jesus does that. That's the point. It's only Him. It's why when we submit to Him, we are released towards freedom. I am so free that I don't need anything, and none of those things would ever satisfy me. Until you can say that, until you can look whatever it is in the face and say that, you truly aren't free. That's the point of what's being said here. Freedom for some of us is the ability to walk into the mall and see all sorts of wonderful things and go, you know what? I don't really need that. Freedom for a person like me is the ability to drive past a car dealership and say, I think my truck's just fine, right? Freedom for some of us is to go, the house I live in and the place that I get to lay my head is so sufficient. Freedom is this ability to say, I could, but I just don't need it. That's freedom. That's freedom, especially in a culture like ours. I don't know if you've noticed this. I don't live, and you don't live in a culture that values restraint. Have you noticed this? Like, just go to Old Country Buffet and you'll see this firsthand, right? Like, we do not value restraint. In fact, we live in a culture that encourages more, right? We live in a culture that encourages options, like replete options. Just recently, I went to go get some jeans. Every couple of years, a guy needs a new pair of jeans. And so I went to the mall to go get jeans, and I just wanted some Levi's. And I think, like in my mind, I know, like, this might date me, but I'm just sort of old-fashioned. Like, when I think Levi's, I'm just thinking a basic pair of jeans. And in fact, some of us remember, Scott, you probably remember back in the day, we could buy 501s, right? It was simple. You bought 501s, and they'd never been washed. So you sort of guessed at what you would wear. You washed them, and whatever came out, whatever size, no matter how high they were, you're like, I guess that's good, right? So I go to the mall to buy some Levi's, and I show up, and there's like a kiosk for Levi's. There's all these jeans, and there was a guide. There was like a map of all the different things, and there was like not just 501s. It was like there was 528s and 564s and 513s and 521s. And like I'm looking at all these things, and literally the options went on and on. I'm not exaggerating. I think there were like 10 or 15 options of jeans. There were like skinny jeans for young guys. There were skinny jeans for old guys, right? Those kinds of distinctions. There's boot cut. There's like big fat quad cut. There's like all sorts of like, different cuts. Athletic cut, which is another way for guys like me to not feel like they're fat. That's all that is. Like they just kind of go in like husky version, whatever. Like I'm looking at all of it, and I looked and I was like, whatever happened to just like a pair of jeans that doesn't cut off the circulation in my feet? That's all I want, right? Just give me some good old-fashioned jeans, right? We're in a culture of options. We're in a culture of Old Country Buffet. We're in a culture of more is always better. And the more options we have, the better our life is going to be. And yet, ironically, when you sit around with your friends, do you hear anybody saying, with all of these options in life, things are so much better and easier? Like, we don't hear that, do we? There's nobody saying, hey, with all of this excess, aren't we just so much healthier today? No, we're not saying that. All of the excess, all of the options, all of the lack of restraint, it's not doing anything to help us. And the question is, where are the people of restraint? Where are the people who can say, I think I've had enough? Where are the people who can look at stuff and just say, I'm good? And is it possible that the idea in the middle of this whole passage is that in order for there to be a people who are unlike other people, a people who are given to life, not death, that it might have something to do with excess and restraint and true freedom? Could it be that real freedom is what makes a certain group of people unlike any other group of people? I want to end with Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23 says this. It says in verse 1, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, and I'll just clarify, we're talking about a leader, not the ruler that you have in school. Some people earlier today struggled with that. They just imagined a ruler as an eating utensil, and thank you, Lindsay, for laughing at that. Now, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, it's going to be different than when you sit down to eat at your table, right? When you sit down to eat with a ruler, you're going to see some things you wouldn't normally see at your Monday night family dinner. You're going to see a spread like you're not used to seeing. You are going to be exposed to a culture of excess. So the writer of Proverbs says, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what's before you. And then surprisingly in verse 2, he says, and put a knife to your throat if you're given to appetite. Do you think the writer of Proverbs has everybody's attention when he describes a knife to the throat? He does, doesn't he? He says, if you're given to appetite. It's interesting, this word appetite is the Hebrew word nephesh. The Hebrew word nephesh, in nearly every other place that we find it, is the Hebrew word for soul. So for example, in Genesis, when God breathed air into the lungs of Adam, he made him a living nephesh. He came to life. He was a living soul. And in the Hebrew consciousness, a nephesh's purpose, a soul's purpose, the reason that a living being lived was to worship and glorify God. And so this became a standard understanding. The word nephesh became synonymous with longing for God. It became synonymous with this idea of desiring something at the core of your being. And interestingly enough, the writer of Proverbs leverages this word and says, if you sit at the table and you nephesh for the food that's in front of you, if your soul longs for this more than God, it's better that you put a knife to your throat because you're out of control. This isn't just a food thing. This is a God thing. And somehow in the middle of our restraint, and somehow in the middle of our excess, somehow in the middle of our freedom, there is this dynamic of us becoming the kind of people who relate to God the way they were created to relate to God. And so we end with this tonight. Is the best thing for you or for me to get everything you want? This is a real question for us in our culture. Because our culture says it's the best thing. You get everything you want anytime you want it. Is it? Is it? And maybe the better question is this. Is there any area of your life where when God begins to meddle in the details, like maybe when I began tonight, there are certain things where you thought, well, God doesn't care about this. Is there any area of your life where when God begins to be specific around the small things that you begin to cringe and feel uncomfortable? Is there anywhere in your life where you begin to feel nervous? Is there anywhere where you start to feel like maybe God is starting to step on your freedoms and your rights? If there's any place like that in your life, then that is the place that is creating a boundary, a barrier between you living as a truly free person and living as a slave. And he is setting us free. Jesus calls us in the same way that God called the people out of Egypt so that we could be free. Amen. Would you stand with me? May you this week be men and women who experience the freedom that is only found in Jesus Christ. May you know restraint, not for restraint's sake, but for the sake of you knowing God intimately. Amen. Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here tonight. If you haven't met some people around you, say hi to a few people as you leave, and feel free to hang out for a few minutes and chat.